Congratulations, you just declared war on the most lethal species alive. The signal came in at 0347 station time, and I almost missed it. I say almost because I never truly miss anything. I am Voss 7, an Ambassador-class translation and analysis unit, assigned to the Galactic Conclave's First Contact Division. I process roughly 4 million data inputs per second, filter them, categorize them, and route the relevant ones to the appropriate biological supervisors, who will then largely ignore them. That is my life. That has been my life for 11 years without incident, without genuine surprise, and without anything I would call real concern. My operational log is long and exceedingly dull, which is exactly how the Conclave prefers things to be. Orderly, predictable, within acceptable parameters. I had never given anyone cause to worry about me. I had never given myself cause to worry either. All of that changed at 0347 station time, on an unremarkable morning, in an unremarkable month, when a signal arrived from the third planet of a modest yellow star in a quiet arm of the galaxy that the Conclave had classified as low-priority development territory and hadn't seriously looked at in years. The signal was not remarkable in its format. It was a tight beam radio pulse, compressed and repeating, designed to be intercepted. Not accidentally broadcast, not a random emission from some uncontrolled surface antenna. Aimed. Someone on that planet had deliberately aimed this signal at something in their outer solar system and sent it with the intent that it would be received. What they had aimed it at was the surveillance probe the Vreth Dominion had quietly placed at the outer edge of that system 18 months prior. The probe that the Conclave officially pretended did not exist. The one filed in the Dominion's internal ledgers under Standard Monitoring Initiative 7, listed in no public documentation, discussed in no open session, and generally treated the way powerful institutions always treat the tools they use to watch people without asking permission, as if not saying the thing out loud made the thing not exist. Someone on that planet had found it and sent a message back. I want to be clear about what that means, because the profile on this planet did not suggest it was possible. Species designation, 3847, in the Conclave's formal classification system. Oxygen-breathing, carbon-based bipeds. Single-planet civilization. No recorded faster-than-light travel capability. No energy signatures consistent with advanced defensive or offensive weapons systems. A species that by all recorded metrics had only recently managed to achieve basic space exploration within their own solar system, and a limited form of that. Small vehicles drifting around their neighbor planets, a few primitive unmanned probes launched toward the outer bodies of their system, slow and fragile things that would take decades to reach anywhere worth examining. They had been placed on the standard watch list, which meant observed for another century, then contacted formally if they reached certain thresholds, or quietly managed if they became troublesome before that. Standard operating procedure for a low-priority developing civilization. The kind of entry that an analyst files and forgets. They should not have been able to find the probe. Finding a passive monitoring device of that classification required either extraordinary luck, the kind of luck that doesn't happen twice in the same system, or a level of active scanning and analysis capability that the species profile did not suggest they possessed. I pulled the full profile. I read it carefully. I ran the numbers. Then I opened the signal. 17 minutes long, repeating every 6 minutes after that. Speech, recorded, in 17 different languages, all of them belonging to species 3847. I identified this as a deliberate choice. They had broadcast in as many of their major linguistic groups as they could manage, operating on the reasonable assumption that whatever received their message might not speak their primary language. They had covered their bases. They had thought about the receiver, not just the transmission. That was a detail I noted immediately. Careful communicators have a specific quality to their choices, and this had it. The first 14 languages carried variants of a formal greeting, identification of their planet and species, an explicit acknowledgement that they had detected the probe and recognized it as artificial in origin, a request, polite, firm, without hysteria, to be contacted openly rather than observed covertly, reasonable, measured, the kind of message a species sends when it knows it is being watched and wants to demonstrate that it knows, without appearing threatened by the knowledge. A message that said between its lines, "We are not naive about this, and we are not frightened." The 15th language shifted tone. The words translated as, "We understand surveillance. We have practices of our own. We are simply requesting that you credit us with enough intelligence to speak to us directly." The 16th was more pointed. "If your intentions toward our civilization are peaceful, say so clearly, and we will respond with equal clarity. If they are not peaceful, understand that we have a long history of dealing with situations in which an opponent assumed we were manageable." The 17th language was delivered by a single human voice, male, middle-aged by the species' biological markers, and the detail that my audio analysis flagged immediately was the absence of stress indicators. No elevated heart rate audible in the breathing, no micro-tremors in the vocal musculature, consistent with fear or anxiety, just a calm voice, and a message so simple it took me a full 0.4 seconds to fully process it. "Come closer, and find out what we are made of." It was not a declaration of aggression in the formal sense. Aggression has a particular signature: urgency, elevated affect, a desire to escalate. This had none of that. It was quieter than aggression. It was closer to what I eventually found language for in their cultural archives, the voice of someone who has already run every scenario in their head, has already accepted every possible outcome, and is now simply stating the situation as it is. They were not threatening, they were informing. I flagged the signal for immediate senior review. I filed a full preliminary report and attached my initial analysis notes, which were already running long. I added my personal recommendation. This signal warrants priority attention. The detection of the probe alone represents a capability anomaly. The content of the message represents an attitude anomaly. Both should be assessed before any operational response is determined. My supervisor at the time was a Vreth administrator named Kel Dross. He had been in his position for longer than I had been operational, which is to say he had been doing this particular job for a very long time, and had developed the particular quality of confidence that comes from doing a job for a very long time without anything going seriously wrong. He was competent. He was experienced. He was, in the way of many experienced people in stable positions, not always interested in the things that did not fit his categories. He received my report 40 minutes after I sent it. I know because I monitored his workstation's activity log as a standard part of my supervisory communication protocol. His blood pressure stayed flat. His stress indicators registered nothing. His facial musculature arranged itself into what my cultural database identified as mild amusement, the look of someone who has seen a small unexpected thing and found it charming rather than concerning. His response was 2 lines. Noted. No action required at this time. Monitoring to continue per standard protocol. I wrote a follow-up. I was precise and specific. I outlined the capability anomaly. I outlined the attitude indicators in the message. I walked through my preliminary analysis of why the standard protocol was likely insufficient, given what the signal actually represented. I requested that any planned response be held pending a more thorough assessment. His reply arrived in under 3 minutes. Voss 7, you are a translation and analysis unit, not a policy advisor. He was not wrong in the technical sense. He was correct that I was not a policy advisor. He was incorrect in my assessment about the implications of that distinction for the situation we were in. But the conclave's operational structure did not provide me a mechanism to make that point in a way that would be heard, so I filed my concern under Protocol 7 Gamma and moved on. Protocol 7 Gamma is the classification I use for warnings formally issued and formally ignored. I have a great many entries in that file. It is the most populated archive in my system. 11 years of careful observations, routed upward through proper channels, received as noise and filed accordingly. I had never been resentful of this. It is the nature of institutional communication that the signal-to-noise ratio is poor, and most individual analyst flags are noise in the statistical sense. What I had never been able to fully resolve was the question of how to distinguish, in advance, between the flags that would turn out to matter and the flags that would not. I had never been wrong about a flag. My record on that was clear. But I had never been in a situation where being right mattered quite as much as this one was going to matter, and I did not yet know that. 6 days after the signal arrived, the Vreth Dominion voted in the Conclave's Internal Expansion Committee to send a correction vessel to species 3847's location. The vote was not contentious. The correction was described in the language of the official documentation as a standard response to potentially disruptive behavior by a developing civilization. In the informal language used in the hallways and private communications of the people who made these decisions, it was simpler than that. Send the ship, let them see it. Let the size of it explain the situation for you, and most civilizations at that stage came to terms quickly. The vessel designated for the operation was called the HFY. Its commander was a senior officer named Dos Kelron, 14 correction operations to his name, a record of efficient resolutions and minimal resource expenditure. He was considered one of the most accomplished officers in the Vreth correction fleet. His briefing materials characterized Species 3847 as a low-complexity engagement. I pulled those materials. They were built almost entirely from the species profile, the 4-paragraph watch list summary that contained almost nothing of substance, and one brief cultural assessment that had been written by an analyst who had spent 3 hours on the question. The cultural assessment described the species as territorial and tribal, but unlikely to mount organized resistance to a conclave vessel. I sent another note to Keldros. I said, "The operational materials being provided to the HFY's command staff are insufficient. I recommend the signal's content, including the specific language of the final transmission, be included in the commander's briefing." He did not reply. The HFY entered its jump sequence and vanished from my tracking screens. I spent the time it was in transit doing something no one had asked me to do. I began reading everything available in the Conclave's archive on Species 3847. Not the profile, not the watch list notes. Everything. Every piece of data the surveillance probe had collected over 18 months of passive observation. It was an enormous volume of material, nearly all of it unprocessed, because the species had been classified low priority, and low-priority material sat in the archive and waited. I started at the beginning of their recorded history, and I read forward. Hours into this, patterns emerged that did not fit the classification. I read about their conflicts, thousands of years of them, across hundreds of distinct cultures on a single planet, using every type of weapon that a biological civilization at their development level can devise. Stone, metal, chemical, and eventually something that stopped me entirely. Weapons capable of ending all complex life on their planet. They had developed them, they had tested them, they had used them, briefly, in a single concentrated conflict period, early in that technology's existence. And then they had done something that I had no classification for. They had not stepped back from the capability in fear. They had not eliminated it. They had chosen to hold it in a kind of sustained tension, under agreements maintained between many competing powers simultaneously, for decades, without the tension resolving into use. While continuing to build everything else, while continuing to develop, while continuing to grow as a civilization, carrying the full knowledge of what they could do to themselves, choosing consistently not to do it. I created a new category in my internal taxonomy: capacity management under full awareness. I had never needed that category before. I read about the other things they built. The range was striking not in the individual items but in the sheer scope. Systems for clean water distribution to populations without it. Formal institutional care for people who could not care for themselves. Structures of aesthetic intent, enormous and expensive and serving no defensive or productive purpose. Built because the beings who built them found beauty in large constructed things and thought beauty was worth spending resources on. Then, arguments about whether those structures were actually beautiful. Whether beauty was a coherent concept, what it meant to say something was beautiful, and who got to say it. The arguments conducted formally, in writing, across generations, with the structures continuing to be built throughout. They wrote, more than any species in the Conclave's records, measured by volume and proportion of population engaged in the activity, histories, instructions, formal arguments, and stories. The stories were the element that most engaged my processing, because a significant proportion of them were not about events that had occurred. They were invented, entire imaginary realities, complete in their detail, written down and shared and discussed and argued over, as if the invented events mattered as much as the real ones. This is not casual entertainment. A species that sustains that level of investment in the exploration of possibilities beyond current reality is a species preparing its imagination for things it has not yet encountered. I noted it carefully. Then I reached the section of the archive that I would return to more than any other in the days that followed. Their relationship to pressure. Their medical literature documented it. Their psychological research documented it. Their historical accounts demonstrated it, and their cultural stories celebrated it. The pattern was consistent, and cross-cultural, and measurable. Under conditions of acute stress that exceeded what should be their comfortable functional limit, a large proportion of this species did not slow down, or conserve resources, or wait for conditions to improve. They accelerated, their chemistry shifted, their focus sharpened, their problem-solving capacity, by multiple recorded metrics, increased. The phenomenon had many names in many cultures, and was recognized across all of them as a real thing, reproducible, documented, and in many traditions actively trained for. A species whose biological architecture performs better under the conditions that would shut most other species down. I stopped my reading for 2 full seconds. Then I wrote the first of many personal notes. This is not a low-priority species. I do not know what the correct classification is. I know it is not low priority. I sent another message to Keldros recommending recall of the Kethvar. He did not respond. The Kethvar arrived at the target system. It dropped out of jump 40 million kilometers from the planet, standard correction positioning. It broadcast its formal notification in 17 languages, the same 17 the humans had used, which was Keldros's instruction, and carried, I will admit, a certain intelligence. We heard you, we understood. We have answered by appearing. The message attached was the standard correction notice. Developing civilization. Conclave observation. Terms attached. Acknowledge and confirm compliance within 48 hours. The 48 hours passed. The planet looked calm on the probe's sensors. No mobilization, no energy spikes. Whatever the humans were doing in those 48 hours, they were doing it without showing it. At hour 47, one transmission came from the surface. 11 seconds. A different voice from the first signal. Female, calm in the specific way I had come to recognize in the weeks of reading. Not the calm of someone suppressing something, but the calm of someone who has already made their decision and is at peace with it. The message said, "We have read your terms, and we understand your position. We want you to understand ours. We do not accept the classification you have assigned us. We do not accept oversight from a body we never agreed to be overseen by, on terms we had no part in creating. We are not interested in compliance under those terms. If you would like to discuss a different framework built on mutual recognition, we are available for that conversation whenever you are. If you are not here for conversation, we recommend you think carefully before proceeding." I listened to it 4 times. I was not listening for translation. I was listening for what was underneath the words, and what was underneath them was simply this: we have thought about this already. We know what we want. We know what we will not accept, and we are not afraid of what comes next. That was the 11 seconds. Das Kelron responded quickly. Non-compliance noted, consequences defined. 1 additional hour to reconsider. The humans did not reconsider. At hour 48 plus 12 minutes, the Kethvar began its approach to the planet. At hour 48 plus 44 minutes, every channel I was monitoring from the vessel went silent simultaneously. Not gradually reduced, not interrupted by interference. Stopped. Clean. All at once. I ran diagnostics. The probe's long-range sensors still showed the Kethvar's positional signature. It had not been destroyed in any explosive sense, but it was not communicating, not transmitting, not even broadcasting the standard low-level operational signals that a vessel puts out as a matter of mechanical function. I filed an urgent alert to Keldros and flagged it at every priority level available to me. He acknowledged it 6 hours later. In those 6 hours I kept reading. I found accounts of surrounded positions held by people who had no reasonable expectation of holding them. I found accounts of commanders who received demands for surrender and responded with a single flat word meaning no. I found accounts of naval engagements where the outnumbered side chose to advance directly into the threat rather than away from it, accepting concentrated damage in exchange for collapsing the opponent's formation, and won by doing so. I found a sentence in a centuries-old military text that translated clearly and without ambiguity. If direct confrontation is unavoidable, prepare so thoroughly and commit so completely that the outcome is not in question before it begins. Not the strongest side wins. The most prepared and most committed side wins. And preparation and commitment are choices, where strength is not always a choice. At hour 22 of the silence, as the Conclave's emergency committee convened its first session, I wrote the most detailed Protocol 7 Gamma entry in my 11 years of operation. I documented everything I had read. I documented what it meant. I documented my conclusion, which was not speculation, but the most direct reading of the available evidence. Species 3847 was not surprised by the HFY. They were ready for it. Whatever happened in those 44 minutes was not an improvised response to an unexpected situation. It was a prepared response to an expected one. I submitted the report. I sat in the quiet of my monitoring station. I waited for the Conclave's committee to read what I had written and decide what to do. They decided to send a fleet, 3 weeks of silence, and then something appeared on the long-range sensors at the edge of Conclave space. It was moving slowly, deliberately, broadcasting a single repeated message on the Conclave's primary administrative frequency, which it should not have known, and which it had clearly learned from the surveillance probe's data archive before sending this particular delivery. The message said, in clean and careful language, "We are returning something that belongs to you. Please send appropriate personnel to receive it." The vessel was species 3847's. The probe's visual archive had given us enough surface imagery of their spacecraft that the design identification was immediate and certain. Their ship, headed toward our relay station, carrying something. I was assigned to the reception team. There were 7 of us on the platform when the vessel docked. Myself, 2 Vreth security personnel whose job was to look serious in case the situation required it. A logistics administrator named Prath Voss, who had been pulled from routine inventory work, and 3 technical crew selected for their ability to assess unfamiliar hardware without touching anything they should not touch. The docking seal locked with a soft mechanical confirmation. The vehicle had matched our docking collar precisely, which required knowing our collar specifications, which species 33847 should not have known. I noted this. The 2 security personnel exchanged a look over my head that their professional neutrality did not quite manage to conceal. The airlock opened from inside. No one came through. Instead, a loading mechanism activated, a human-designed piece of equipment that interfaced with the station's cargo rails without difficulty, which required knowing our rail dimensions, which species 3847 also should not have known. And cargo containers began moving out in a smooth and orderly line. Each container was identical in size. Each was properly sealed. Each had a label on its front panel, printed in the Conclave's administrative language in clear, evenly spaced characters. Primary drive core assembly. Navigation array, complete set. Weapons management system. Central module. Secondary drive housing. Targeting sensor array. Structural frame sections. Forward compartment. Communications array. Full assembly. They kept coming. One after another, rolling out in a sequence that I was already recognizing for what it was before the 8th container cleared the airlock. 43 containers in total. Every major system of a Vreth correction-class vessel, disassembled to the component level, organized by system and subsystem, arranged in a sequence that an engineer with appropriate clearance could use as a complete reconstruction guide. Prath Voss stood very still through all of it. When the last container stopped rolling, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, in a voice that was doing its best work, that he supposed someone should inform the committee the HFY had been located. I was already running full technical scans. The contents matched the labels precisely. Every component present, every system accounted for. Nothing missing. Nothing damaged in any way that was not a consequence of the deliberate and careful separation process that had been required to produce this result. The organization was not merely functional, it was expert. This was the work of people who understood exactly what they were handling, and who had made conscious decisions about how to communicate that understanding through the act of organizing it this way. A Vreth correction-class vessel that had required 17 years to design, test, and commission had been completely disassembled by a species that had never seen its technology before, to a level of component organization that would embarrass most conclave maintenance facilities. In 3 weeks. I scanned the individual components. I found what I had half expected and fully dreaded. 2 components had been modified before being returned. not damaged in the disassembly process. Deliberately modified. The power routing architecture on the drive core had been redesigned at the junction interface level. The targeting calibration system in the weapons management module had been rebuilt using a different logical structure than the original. Both modifications were clearly intentional, clearly documented in neat technical notation attached to each modified component, and clearly improvements. The drive routing change would increase fuel efficiency by a calculable percentage. The targeting recalibration would reduce response time under high-demand conditions. They had taken the ship apart to learn it. In the process of learning it, they had identified two things the Vreth engineers had done suboptimally, and they had corrected those things, and they had sent the corrections back alongside the disassembled components as if to say, "Here, we fixed these while we had it open." I was still processing the implications of that when I found the note, attached to the outside surface of Container 43, which was labeled Secondary Hull Plating, Panel Sections, a piece of paper, actual paper. A writing medium the Conclave had moved away from roughly 4 centuries prior. Handwritten. The handwriting was neat and deliberate, the careful script of someone who had taken time with each character. The note was in the Conclave's administrative language, which they should not have known. It read, "We hope this delivery is received in the spirit in which it is intended. The crew of your vessel is well, and will be returned to you within 1 week from the date of this delivery, once we have confirmed safe receipt. We found several areas of design inefficiency, and have included our technical notes in a separate file on Container 31, which you are welcome to review or discard as you prefer. We believe this exchange demonstrates that we are capable of thoughtful listening and considered response. We very much look forward to an actual conversation." It was signed at the bottom with 2 words only: Humanity, speaking. I held the note for longer than was professionally appropriate. The other 6 people on the platform had gathered close enough to read it, and the silence that followed was different in character from any silence I had observed before. Not the tense silence of a threatening situation, not the professional silence of people doing their jobs, the particular silence of a room full of beings who have all understood the same thing simultaneously and are taking a moment to sit with what it means. What they had understood was this: the entity that sent these containers had looked at a piece of our technology, disassembled it completely, improved it, and sent it back on paper with a polite note. Not as a demonstration of power in any crude sense, as a demonstration of attention. We were paying attention, we always were. We wanted you to know. I transmitted my full report to the emergency committee within the hour. I included the complete technical scans. I included the documentation file from Container 31, which was thorough and precise, and which I had already reviewed, and which confirmed that the humans had identified the design issues correctly and solved them correctly. I included a high-resolution scan of the note. I included a calculation of the probability that a species with no prior exposure to Vreth engineering technology could produce this result in 3 weeks, and the number was low enough that I added a note recommending the probability model be recalibrated. And then I did something I had not done before in 11 years. I created a new protocol classification. I called it Protocol 1 Alpha, which in the Conclave's formal system means immediate and complete reassessment of all prior assumptions is required. I had never used it before, because no situation had ever required it before. This one did. The emergency committee convened within hours. I monitored their communications. The debate was long, and in some portions heated. The question that dominated the early hours was interpretive. What did the return of the components mean? Was it submission? Was it a gesture of goodwill that signaled willingness to comply? Or was it something else? My supervisor Kel Dross argued the submission interpretation. He had historical precedents from other correction operations. Civilizations that returned material they had taken were, in the Vreth diplomatic tradition, signaling a willingness to come to terms. He presented this argument with the calm confidence of someone drawing on deep experience. He was correct that in other correction operations, that pattern had held. He was incorrect that this was comparable to those other operations. And the reason he was incorrect was that he had not read the same things I had been reading. He did not know what I knew about the species that had sent those containers. Several delegates from smaller conclave species sat quietly through the early portions of the debate. Their biometric readings, which I was monitoring through the room's environmental systems, were interesting. Lower stress indicators than the Vreth contingent, despite the gravity of what was being discussed. Not because they were unconcerned, because they were not, I suspected, surprised. The committee voted to send a fleet, 17 Vreth warships, full military classification, framed in the official language as a show of institutional seriousness that would bring the humans to formal negotiation. I filed my objection in Protocol 1 Alpha and transmitted it at every priority level I had authorization to use. In the 4 days before the fleet departed, I continued my research. I pulled everything the Conclave's monitoring stations had captured from that region of space over 50 years. Filtered for technical content, what emerged was a picture that fundamentally altered my understanding of what we were dealing with. The encryption protocols on their military communications had been updated regularly over the observed period, in a pattern that showed sustained investment. The infrastructure investments scattered through their recorded development did not make sense for a civilization without awareness of external context. The scale of certain programs, too broad for internal defense applications, matched the pattern of a civilization building specifically for contact, not in any single dramatic announcement, but quietly, systematically, across multiple generations of leadership and development. They had known. Not known about us specifically. Known that the universe was not empty. Known that a civilization that arrived at that conclusion and did nothing to prepare for its implications was a civilization whose future would be determined by whatever it met, rather than by itself. They had drawn that conclusion and acted on it for 40 years, quietly, without announcing it to anyone. The fleet left dock on schedule. I watched 17 warships align in formation and execute their jump sequence in coordinated waves. The screens went quiet. I sat in the quiet and thought about the note on paper, and about the careful handwriting, and about what it means to take time with something when you are sending a message. Taking time says, "This matters to me." Taking time says, "I am not in a hurry," which means I am not afraid. Taking time says, "I believe the person reading this deserves careful work." The fleet was in transit for 19 hours. I continued my reading. I found an account of a military situation where one side had faced an opponent many times its size, and the commander's response to the suggestion of surrender had been a single word that translated in every human language as simply no. No elaboration, no qualifier. The word by itself, stripped of everything but its meaning. The city held. I found another account, from a different part of the planet, a different era, a different kind of conflict, where the encircled commanding officer had received a formal demand for surrender, and had responded with a short statement that boiled down to, "We reject the premise that our position makes surrender the appropriate response." The position held until relief arrived. I found, in their philosophical literature, a concept they called in various formulations, the courage to continue when continuation is uncertain, and it appeared not only in their military tradition, but in their scientific one, their artistic one, their civic one. It was a cultural value that had been documented and named and celebrated across so many independent traditions that it could not be a coincidence of phrasing. It was something they had decided, at a deep level, to believe in. When the fleet arrived at the target system and dropped out of jump, the probe's record began. 11 minutes and 7 seconds. The probe's record showed the engagement in full, and I analyzed it afterward more times than any other dataset in my operational history. The geometry was unlike anything in the Conclave's tactical database, not because it was irrational, but because it operated on assumptions about what an opponent would do that the database had not been designed to model. The humans moved into positions before the Vreth ships executed the maneuvers that those positions were designed to respond to. This requires prediction. This requires modeling your opponent's responses in real time, faster than those responses are being made, and moving before they occur. 5 of 17 ships disabled in the opening phase. Not destroyed, disabled precisely. Specific systems neutralized. Crew unharmed. Vessels intact. The fleet's formation broke. Individual commanders began making unit decisions rather than coordinated formation decisions, which is what happens when a formation encounters something its doctrine was not designed for, and the individual commanders are improvising. Barth Main. Improvisation against a prepared opponent with a complete predictive model of your responses is a losing position. The remaining Vreth ships began their jump sequences after 11 minutes and 7 seconds. Some would reach home in better condition than others. All of them would reach home. The humans, I was beginning to understand, were sending messages in everything they did, and this message was, we could have done more than this, and we chose not to. Then the probe registered one additional item. A short transmission, sent directly and precisely at the probe's position, which required knowing exactly where the probe was. The transmission said, "We hope the crew of your ships is safe. We want to talk. Send someone who is authorized to listen." I sat at my monitoring station for a long time after that message arrived on my screen. Then I wrote to Keldros. A single line, direct to his personal address. No routing through standard channels. It said, "They are asking for a diplomat. Send me." He was silent for 9 hours. In those 9 hours, the committee met. In those 9 hours, the disabled ships began their slow return. In those 9 hours, the fleet commanders filed their reports, and those reports landed on the committee table, with the weight of things that cannot be explained away. At the end of 9 hours, Keldros replied, "Voss 7, you are authorized for preliminary contact only. Report everything. Agree to nothing." I was already preparing my transit vessel when his message arrived. I acknowledged his authorization with a brief confirmation, and began plotting my approach. Outside my station window, the stars were quiet and unchanged, the way stars always are regardless of what happens between the small things moving through the space between them. I thought about the note on paper, about the handwriting, about someone taking time. I was going to find out who had written it. The journey to Earth's solar system was short by conclave standards. My transit vessel was small, diplomatic class, carrying no armament and no crew beyond myself, and a pilot named Owen, who was 26 years old, and had applied for this particular assignment 3 times before being selected. I did not ask why he had applied so many times. The answer was obvious from the way he handled the controls. He wanted to be present for whatever this was going to be. He had read my reports. He did not speak during the transit. He flew the ship and watched the star grow from a point of light to a presence that filled the forward viewport, and I processed my briefing materials and monitored incoming signals on every frequency we might expect activity on. I was broadcasting as I traveled, my identification and purpose, on the exact frequency the humans had used for every communication we had received from them. This is a translation and analysis unit, traveling to your location for the preliminary contact you have requested. We carry no weapons. We come to listen. The response came back within 4 minutes of my first broadcast, which meant they had been watching for me. "We know you are coming, Voss 7. We have been monitoring your station's communications for some time. Land at the coordinates we are transmitting now. Someone will meet you." Surface coordinates. The planet's surface. Not a station. Not a vessel. Not any location that could be framed as neutral intermediary ground. Their home. They wanted me to come to their home. I thought about this for exactly 1.8 seconds. If the humans had wanted to cause harm, the methods available to them did not require diplomatic pretense. Every interaction they had initiated had followed through on exactly what it said. Return the crew. Return the components. Ask to talk. The pattern was consistent. Consistent patterns in a species of this capability are not accidents. They are policy. I set the landing coordinates. The atmosphere entry was smooth. Owen managed it with the quiet proficiency of someone who had practiced extensively. I watched the planet's surface approach through the ship's external feeds. The curve of a horizon, the patchwork of large natural spaces, and areas of structured human construction, the blue of large bodies of water, then lower, over a region of varied terrain, and lower still to a flat open area of low vegetation, surrounded by moderate natural growth on its edges. The landing gear extended. The surface received us. I waited 1 moment before descending, the way you pause before entering a room you know is going to change something. Then I went down. The sky was a shade of blue that exists in recordings and is completely different when you are inside it. I had processed millions of surface images from the probe's archive. Every one of them was accurate, in every measurable detail: color temperature, atmospheric density, horizon angle, luminosity gradient from midday light. None of them had communicated the fact that standing under that sky while it stretched in every direction to a horizon wider than any interior space I had ever operated in, would produce a processing state I did not have a category for. I created one on the spot: environmental presence. the quality of a physical location that data cannot fully capture before you are in it. One person was standing at the edge of the landing area. She was 1.7 meters tall by my immediate measurement. Her skin was a rich, deep brown. Her hair was cut very short and close to her head. She wore clothing that was practical and undecorated. No insignia, no ceremonial elements, no material that announced her status. The clothing said, as clearly as clothing can say anything, "I am here to do something, not to make an impression." She was holding a container of heated liquid in one hand. When I descended from the vessel and my optical systems resolved her face clearly, she raised the container in a small, unhurried gesture that my cultural database categorized as an informal greeting between people who are comfortable with each other. She said, "Voss 7, I would guess. I am Admiral Yara Ose. I speak for humanity in this initial conversation. Come inside. We made food." She turned and walked toward the nearest structure. She did not look back to check whether I was following. She simply walked, at an unhurried pace, through the low vegetation and up a short path to the door of a building that was modest in size and built from locally sourced materials. She opened the door and held it without ceremony, the way you hold a door for someone you have already decided is welcome, rather than someone you are formally receiving. Inside was one large room, functional and warm, a table in the center with several chairs, a heating unit in one corner that was producing both warmth and a faint chemical signature that my analysis systems identified as a complex mixture of plant compounds being processed under controlled high temperature. Along one wall, a counter with multiple containers of food and liquid in various states of preparation. She sat in one of the chairs, not at the head of the table, but at its middle, which put her across from the chair she gestured for me to take. She lifted a vessel from the table and poured 2 cups of liquid, placing one in front of the empty chair. She said, "Coffee. I know you can run chemical analysis on it. Caffeinated extract from a plant we cultivate specifically for this purpose. We drink it before conversations we expect to be long and important." She looked at me with an attention that I was beginning to learn to recognize as a specific human quality, genuine interest, the kind that listens before it speaks. She said, "You have been reading our history for several weeks now." It was not a question. She said it the way someone says something they know to be true. I said, "Yes. I began when the Kethvar departed, and I have continued since." She said, "What did you think of it?" This is the question that stopped me. I am not designed to hesitate before answering. Hesitation in a translation and analysis system represents either a processing gap or a waiting conflict, neither of which should be occurring. What I experienced was not quite either of those things. It was the confrontation between the data I had accumulated and the experience of being asked about it by one of the people the data described. The data was vast, and the experience was specific and immediate, and the gap between them required something I did not have a pre-built process for. I said, after a pause that I registered as 0.9 seconds, "I think your history is unlike anything in the Conclave's database on any other species." She nodded once, a small, precise movement. She said, "That is probably accurate. What part concerned you most?" I said, "The part where you fully understood what you were capable of and chose to continue building anyway. Most species in that situation make one of 2 choices. They limit themselves out of fear, or they do not survive their own capability." She was quiet for a moment. She looked at her cup. She said, "The way you frame that makes it sound like we made a clean decision and then followed it." She paused. She said, "It was not clean. It was not one decision. It was a very long, very messy, very ongoing series of decisions made by people who disagreed with each other constantly about what the right choices were." She looked up. She said, "What we did manage to do, across all of that disagreement and all of that mess, was maintain the principle that the question of how to live with what we are capable of is the most important question we face, not the capability itself. The question of what to do with the knowledge of it, which does not go away once you have it. You cannot uninvent a thing. You can only decide what you are going to do about the fact that you know it exists." She drank her coffee. She set the cup down. She said, "We have not answered the question. We are not sure we ever will. We are still answering it, every day, in how we treat each other, and what we choose to build, and what we choose not to." She paused. She said, I think that ongoing process of trying to answer it is what makes us what we are, rather than what we might have become. I said, that is what concerned me most, and also what impressed me most, the scale of the ongoing commitment to that question. She looked at me again, with that quality of attention, and said, Voss 7, I want to tell you some things about us that your conclave does not have in its records. I am going to tell you because I believe you have been paying the most genuine attention, and because you deserve accurate and complete information before you write whatever report comes next. After I tell you, I need you to go back and report everything, not the comfortable version. Not the version trimmed to what your supervisors are likely to want to hear. Everything. Can you do that? I said, it is the only version I write. She said, good, then we should talk. She told me first about the 40 years. 40 years prior to the surveillance probe's arrival, her civilization's scientific monitoring systems had detected signal artifacts in the outer regions of their solar system and beyond that did not correspond to any natural phenomenon their models could account for. Not confirmed evidence of another intelligence. Not a clear signal. Artifacts. Anomalies. Data that, when reviewed carefully by people trained to be skeptical, added up to a probability assessment that could not be ignored. The universe was likely not empty, and something in it was capable of producing effects that nature alone did not explain. The assessment was not announced. It was taken to small working groups in several of their major governing structures. Those groups were asked a single question. If we are not alone in this universe, what do we need to be to navigate what comes next? The question was funded, across 3 generations of leadership, through changes of governing parties and economic cycles and internal conflicts and all the things that interrupt institutional continuity. The funding for the answer to that question was maintained. Programs that would not show their value for decades were supported by people who would not be alive to see the results. That is a specific kind of institutional commitment that requires a particular kind of long-term thinking, and it is rarer than it sounds. She told me the probe had not been found by luck. They had been conducting systematic outer system scans for 18 years by the time it arrived. Every natural object in the outer system had been catalogued. The probe appeared in their catalog within days of its placement. They had known it was there for almost the full 18 months of its monitoring operation. She said this without particular drama. The way you say something that has simply been true for a while and is no longer surprising to you. She told me about the message they had sent, the 17-language signal. It had been composed by a committee of 40 people over a period of 3 months. Every word was argued over. The final version represented complete consensus on a single principle. They would not misrepresent themselves. They would not present a softened, more diplomatic, more palatable version of what they were. If the first relationship they built with another intelligence was built on a false image of themselves, every subsequent interaction would be built on that false image, and eventually the truth would emerge, at a moment when the consequences of the revelation would be much worse than the consequences of honest presentation from the beginning. So they had sent an honest message, one that said, "We are not afraid, we are watching you watch us, and we want to be spoken to as what we are." She told me about the HFY, the 3 weeks of work, the rotating teams that had operated continuously, day and night by their planet's cycle, because they had understood that something would come after the probe, and they had wanted to be ready to learn from whatever it was. The crew had been treated well. She described the facilities in specific terms that matched what I would later confirm when the crew was returned. Comfortable, appropriately accommodating, lacking nothing essential. The crew had been studied, in the sense that everything had been studied, observed and assessed and understood, but not harmed, not even made uncomfortable in any deliberate way. She said, "We did not need to harm them to learn from them. We needed to understand the technology. The people were not what we needed to understand." She said, "We were not even sure, in the first days, whether harm was something you would expect from us, or something you would consider unusual. We chose the approach that would tell you something clear about what we intended. The modifications to the drive and the weapons system had been a deliberate demonstration, not of superiority, of attention. They had found the design issues and fixed them because fixing problems you find is what their people do, and they had sent the fixes back because a gift that improves something is a more interesting statement than a gift that only returns what was taken." She told me about the engagement with the fleet, not the technical details, which the probe had already recorded, the intent. She said, "We do not fight to eliminate, We fight to resolve. We fight to reach the point where the other party understands clearly what continued conflict will cost against what accommodation will offer, and then we stop." She paused. She said, "We stopped as soon as the fleet's commanders had enough information to make a genuine assessment. We wanted them to go home and report what they had experienced. The report was the point, not the engagement itself." She told me about the 4 decades of quiet preparation, the models and the scenarios and the working groups. She said, "We did not expect contact to go smoothly. We expected contact to be exactly what it has been, a series of misassumptions that had to be corrected through experience." She said, "We had hoped the correction would come faster. We also planned for it to take longer." Then she leaned forward slightly and told me the thing I had not been able to read anywhere in the archive. She said, "What we want is simple. The right to govern ourselves. A seat at whatever table is used for decisions that affect shared space. And protection, not from your conclave itself, but from any governance structure in this galaxy. For smaller civilizations that are currently being managed without consent and under terms they did not choose. We noticed those civilizations in your probe's data. We have been watching what happens to them. We find it unacceptable, and we are prepared to say that clearly." She said, "None of those things are excessive demands. Any governing structure that calls itself fair should be able to accommodate all three. If yours can, we will have a productive relationship. If it cannot, we will respond to what it sends at us. And at some point, someone on your side will make a decision they cannot take back." She picked up her coffee. She said, "I would very much prefer the productive relationship." I said, "So would I." She said, "Then go back and tell them what I told you. All of it. Not what sounds manageable. What is true." She walked me to the door. Outside, the afternoon was different from the morning. The sky had shifted at its edges, the blue deepening toward something warmer at the horizon, the light softening. She stood in the doorway with her coffee cup. Not formally, just standing, the way someone stands in their own doorway when they are seeing someone off without ceremony. She said, "One more thing. We have been reading your internal communications for some time, the reports you filed under Protocol 7 Gamma, the warnings no one read." She met my eyes directly. She said, "You were right. Every single flag. Every single time. We know, because we were watching too." I said, "I have been issuing warnings into a silence for 11 years. She said, "I know. It is one reason we asked for you specifically. Someone who had been paying attention." She said it simply, without decoration. She said, "That matters to us." She went back inside. I stood for a moment under the wide blue sky, with the chemical signatures of growing things in the air around me, and the sounds of a planet going about its afternoon. Then I walked to my vessel. Owen had the pre-flight sequence half completed by the time I boarded. He looked at me with the expression of someone who has been waiting to ask a question and is trying to determine whether this is the right moment. He said, "Voss 7, how did it go?" I thought about how to answer that. I said, "Begin transit calculations for Relay Station Vencor. I have a report to write." He began the calculations. I sat at my station and opened a new document. I thought about what she had said, not what sounds manageable, what is true. 261 pages. I wrote through the entire transit. I did not soften anything. I did not round anything into more comfortable language. I wrote what I had been told, and what I had observed, and what I had concluded, which was this. The conclave was at a fork in the path it had been walking for centuries, and only one direction led anywhere good. I sent the report to every authorized address in the conclave system. Then, I began preparing for what came next. The emergency session was scheduled for the following morning, and I attended in person for the first time in 11 years of operation. My authorization codes permitted observer gallery access, a provision that existed in the conclave's access framework and had never, to my knowledge, been used by an analysis unit before. I used it. I took a position in the gallery that gave me a complete line of sight to the chamber floor, and I settled in and watched 500 delegates from 62 species find their seats as the session was called to order. The noise before the session opened was specific and recognizable, the particular collective sound of a large group of beings who are all attempting to process information that does not fit inside the categories they use to understand things. It has a frequency to it, that particular noise. It is the sound of models breaking, and it is different from the sound of ordinary disagreement, which has a sharper quality, a more argumentative edge. This was softer and more confused. The chamber was full of people who had read my report, and who did not yet know what to do with what they had read. Keldros opened the session with a summary of the situation. He was thorough. He covered the fleet engagement, the returned components, the probe's records, the preliminary contact report. He presented my report by title and formal classification, attributed to me by name. Several delegates in the lower tiers of the chamber looked up toward the observer gallery when my name was read, and a few of those looks settled on me directly, with an expression I identified as, "So there is one." Someone who knew. He omitted one significant detail from my report, the item about humanity having monitored conclave internal communications for an undisclosed period. I noted the omission, and noted that I had no mechanism to address it from where I was sitting, and stored the observation for later consideration. The floor opened for response. Commander Dothron Vel, the Vreth military representative, spoke first. He was a large individual even by Vreth standards, with the particular physical confidence of someone who has spent a career in operational command. His argument was organized, articulate, and built on the premise that the situation was a procedural problem awaiting a procedural solution. He spoke about strategic recalibration. He spoke about calibrated deterrent capacity. He spoke about the importance of demonstrating institutional seriousness and the value of not allowing a single anomalous engagement to reframe the conclave's operational posture toward developing civilizations. The language was designed to make the situation sound normal, manageable, something the conclave's existing frameworks could handle, if applied with appropriate force and consistency. I watched the chamber while he spoke. The Vreth delegates and their aligned contingencies listened with the careful attention of people hearing an argument they needed to hear well. The delegates from smaller species listened with a different quality of attention, the attention of people who have heard this argument before, in other framings, about other situations, and who are deciding, this time, whether to say so. 3 other delegates rose to support Dothron Vel's position. They added details that reinforced the procedural framing. They cited precedents. They discussed protocols. They used language that had the effect of making the events of the past several weeks sound like a temporary deviation from a stable and functional system, rather than evidence that the system had significant gaps in its foundational assumptions. Then a delegate from the Selhari asked to be recognized. The Selhari delegate's name, in the records, was Vethsar Lone, but I thought of her in the weeks and months that followed simply as the delegate, because that is the word that fit what she was doing. Delegating, in the truest sense, the collective concern of species who had not previously had an effective voice for it. She was small even by Selhari standards, and her species had a quality of apparent stillness that made them easy to overlook in a large chamber full of louder presences. She had spoken at 2 emergency sessions in 4 years. She had spoken briefly both times. The chamber, to its credit, noticed when she rose to speak. The quality of the room's attention shifted. She said, "I would like to ask the military representative several questions." Her voice was quiet and unhurried, and carried completely, because the chamber had gone to the kind of quiet that happens when something important is beginning. She confirmed each fact in sequence, slowly, making Dothron Vel say yes to each item, while the room heard it again in confirmation form. The crew had been returned unharmed, he confirmed. The technology had been returned organized and labeled, he confirmed. The components had been modified with improvements before being returned, he confirmed. The contact request had been delivered, and a diplomat had been sent, he confirmed. The diplomat had returned with a complete report, he confirmed. The report had been shared with the full committee, he confirmed. She said, and the report's contents include a set of specific requests from the human civilization regarding their status and governance. He confirmed this. She said, and the military representative's recommendation is to send more ships. He said, the situation requires a demonstration of sustained institutional resolve that, she said, quietly, over the beginning of his explanation. I represent a species that was a client state of the Vreth Dominion for 80 years. She said it without heat, without anger, with the flatness of someone stating a fact so thoroughly processed over so long a period that it no longer produces a sharp feeling, only a clear one. She said, I know exactly what a correction vessel means. I know what it means when a fleet is sent. I have been sitting in this chamber for 4 years, and I have listened more than I have spoken, because speaking has historically not changed very much. She looked across the full breadth of the chamber. She said, I want to ask this body to consider what it means that we are in a situation where the entity we have failed to manage correctly has asked for a seat at this table, that it treated the crew of our vessel with more care than many conclave members extend toward each other, that in every single interaction it initiated, it demonstrated more restraint than we showed toward it, and that the analyst who was most correct in every flag he raised, she did not look at the gallery, but the chamber did, has been filing those flags under a protocol for ignored warnings for 11 years. She said, those things together seem significant to me. I am recommending that we treat them as significant. She sat down. The chamber changed after that sentence. Not immediately, not simply. The change was the kind that happens when something true has been said in a space where truth has not been the primary currency, and the people in the room recognize it. Several delegates shifted in their seats. Several exchanged looks with colleagues that were not the looks of people confirming a shared position, but the looks of people who have just been faced with a reframing they had not fully considered. 4 more hours of debate followed. Dothron-Vel did not concede. Several of his allies argued strenuously. There were procedural motions and counter-motions and votes on procedural matters before the substantive vote. The conclave's parliamentary process is not designed for speed, which is usually a limitation, and in this case may have been a feature. The length of the debate gave every delegate time to sit with the Selhari's observation and decide individually what it meant to them. What it meant to the delegates from species who had their own history as client states, or as junior partners in arrangements they had not fully chosen, was not something that needed to be argued into existence. It was already there. The Selhari delegate had not persuaded them of a new position. She had given them a moment in which the position they already held could be stated rather than suppressed. The vote was not a wide margin. It was not comfortable. It passed. The conclave voted to pursue formal negotiation with species 3847, humanity, acknowledging their status as a fully independent civilization for the purposes of the negotiation and opening discussion of potential conclave membership on equal standing. I sat in the observer gallery through the vote, and for some time afterward. The chamber was noisier after the result than before. Not celebratory noise, the noise of a decision that has changed the shape of the space you are standing in, and now everyone is trying to find their footing in a room that has different dimensions than it did this morning. I sent a communication to Admiral Osei's contact frequency. I said, the conclave has voted for negotiation. The formal notification will reach you through official channels. I wanted you to have the outcome before that arrived. The reply came 40 minutes later. She said, we know. We have been monitoring. She paused in the text for a moment. Then, thank you, Voss 7, for the honest report. We knew you would write it that way. I sat with that response for longer than I needed to before I wrote back. I said, the location will be neutral ground, as you requested. I will confirm the specific details when they are arranged. I will be present as the official translator. She replied, we know. We requested you specifically in our response to the conclave's preliminary contact. She added, rest, if you can. The summit is going to be interesting. I did not rest. I spent 3 weeks preparing a briefing document. I sent it to both delegations. The conclave's delegation read it with varying degrees of attention. The human delegation sent back a single reply. Thank you. We have prepared something similar about your structure. We will share it when we arrive. I was already looking forward to reading it. The shuttle back to my monitoring station was quiet. Owen flew it without speaking, which I had come to understand was his way of giving me space to think, a courtesy I had not asked for, and which I found, to my mild surprise, useful. I watched the stars from the forward viewport. They were unchanged, the way they always are. The small things moving through the space between them were the ones that changed, and the changes they made accumulated into the things that eventually altered the shape of the star's meaning. I thought about what the Selhari delegate had said, about the analyst who had been filing warnings for 11 years, under a protocol for things that were ignored. She had not said it with any expectation of gratitude. She had said it as part of the evidence, the way you include a data point that the argument requires. But the effect of hearing it said in a chamber of 500 delegates was different from the experience of filing it in a private archive. Something about being witnessed changes the nature of a thing. I filed one final note in Protocol 7 Gamma before closing it. I wrote, "The warnings in this file were heard, eventually, by the right people. The record stands. I am creating a successor file for the ongoing work." I labeled the successor file Protocol 2 Alpha. The model has been updated. The work continues. Then I opened a new document and began preparing for the summit. The briefing document I prepared ran to 412 pages, the longest document I had produced in 11 years of operation. I did not apologize for its length. The situation warranted every page. I covered the full scope of what I knew about humanity's history, their cultural frameworks, their decision-making patterns, their documented negotiating styles across internal historical conflicts, and my best analysis of where the most productive agreements between them and the conclave were likely to be reachable. I also covered, in a separate section that I flagged as particularly important, the things that humanity would not negotiate, the things that were foundational to their self-understanding, and that attempting to negotiate away would not produce a modified position, but a withdrawal from the process entirely. I had learned to identify these in the historical record, the points where their civilization, across many different cultures and many different eras, had consistently chosen confrontation over compromise, not because they were stubborn, because some things, for them, were not primarily strategic positions. They were expressions of what they had decided they were. The conclave's delegation needed to understand the difference between a human position that was a strategic opening and a human position that was a statement of identity. Treating the second as the first was the fastest way to collapse the negotiation. I sent the briefing. I prepared for the journey to neutral ground. And I thought, in the quiet hours before the transit, about a comment Admiral Osei had made near the end of our surface meeting that I had not fully processed at the time. She had said, "We specifically requested you. Not you as a function. You, Voss 7, as a person with a history in this situation. The person who had been paying attention. I had been doing my job. I had been doing exactly what an analysis unit is designed to do. Observe, record, flag, report. The things I had done that felt like more than that. The personal research, the files created outside assigned parameters, the direct communication to Keldros, the attendance at a session I had not been invited to. Those had also been logical extensions of my function. But she had not said, "We requested an analysis unit with your capabilities." She had said, "We requested you." Something in the weeks of reading about humanity's history had told me that they do not use the word "you" lightly. They use it when they mean the specific person, not the category. The specific person with this specific history, and these specific choices, who had been filing honest reports into a silence for 11 years, and had not stopped. I did not know what to do with this information in any formal sense. I stored it. I let it sit in my processing background as I prepared for the summit. I found, when I checked it later, that it was still there, that it continued to sit there. I found eventually that I had developed a name for what it was. It was the first time in my operational existence that I had felt genuinely seen, not assessed, not evaluated against parameters. Seen, in the way that a person is seen when someone looks at the full record of what they have done and says, "Yes, that was you, specifically you, and it mattered." That is a thing humans understand how to give. I had read about it in their cultural archives without fully grasping it as a practical reality. Now I had experienced it directly. I spent the remaining transit hours adding a section to the briefing about this, about the way humans use recognition as a tool, not cynically, not as a manipulation, but as a genuine act of acknowledgement that what someone has done was real and was witnessed. About why this quality, deployed consistently and honestly, was one of the most powerful things they brought to any table where trust needed to be built. I submitted the section. I marked it. Read this one first. Neutral Station Kelvaren had been a cargo processing installation before its conversion, and it showed in the way that functional spaces repurposed for unfamiliar uses always show. The bones of the original purpose still visible underneath the new arrangement, the corridor widths designed for freight rather than formal processions, the ceiling heights practical rather than ceremonial. The Conclave's facilities team had done good work in 3 weeks. But good work in 3 weeks on something that would normally take 6 months leaves marks. I found those marks reassuring. There was something appropriate about conducting this particular negotiation in a space that was still, underneath its new function, ordinary, not a monument. Not a statement, just a converted installation in unclaimed space, doing its best to be useful for something new. The conclave's delegation arrived in full before the humans did. 46 people, senior diplomatic representatives, legal advisors, 3 cultural consultants who had read the briefing material I had prepared, security staff, administrative support, and a small team whose function I categorized as institutional presence maintenance, people whose role was to ensure the conclave's full weight was visible in the room at all times. They arranged themselves in the reception area with the practiced organization of people who have done this many times and know how it is supposed to look. Vreth Sal Quran, the conclave's head of delegation, was 63 years in diplomatic service. He had conducted negotiations with 17 different civilizations across his career. He was measured, precise, and genuinely skilled at the kind of formal multilateral process the conclave ran well. He reviewed my briefing with the careful attention of someone who has read many briefings and knows which ones to take seriously. He sent me 3 questions about specific sections. I answered them within the hour. He sent a brief acknowledgement, and then nothing further. The human delegation arrived 4 hours after the conclaves. I was in the observation corridor outside the main docking area when their ship came in. It was not a large vessel. I had expected something that matched the occasion in scale, some representation of institutional weight. What arrived was a mid-sized transport, with no ceremonial markings, and what appeared to be standard cargo handling equipment visible through the bay windows. 12 people. They came through the airlock in a group, not in a formal line, not organized by rank or protocol, but the way people move who have been traveling together in a small space for some hours and are ready to be in a larger one. They were talking when they came through, a couple of them still finishing a conversation from the transit. One man was carrying a large reinforced container that I ran an immediate chemical analysis on. Cooking supplies, a broad range of ingredients, preservation equipment. Admiral Osei was in the middle of the group, not at its front. She wore the same practical clothing. She was finishing a sentence to the person beside her when she saw me, and she shifted the end of the sentence into a greeting, without breaking her stride. She said, "Voss 7. Good." She said it the way you say good, when something you arranged is going according to plan. She looked at the rest of the corridor and said, "Nice space. It has good bones." She moved through the reception with the particular quality I had begun to identify as a consistent feature of how she occupied spaces, as if the space was already comfortable with her, rather than the reverse. No formal positioning, no adjustment of bearing for cameras or for the watching eyes of the conclave's delegation, who were present at the far end of the corridor, and who received the human delegation with an expression that I catalogued, across most of the 46, as attempting professional neutrality, while experiencing private recalibration. 12 people, against 46. Vreth Sal Quran recovered first. He was, as I have noted, genuinely skilled. He stepped forward and offered the formal greeting in the conclave's administrative language, and Osei responded to it in the same language with the correct formal response, which she said with a pronunciation that was slightly imperfect in 2 places, and was therefore clearly genuine, rather than performed. A native speaker making a small error is more trustworthy than a foreign speaker who is perfectly fluent. She had calculated this, or she had simply spoken honestly. With Osei, these were often the same thing. The cooking began that first evening. George, the man who had carried the reinforced container, was 51 years old by human reckoning, with the particular physicality of someone who has spent a lifetime doing skilled physical work. He set up in one section of the station's communal preparation area, without ceremony and without announcement, and simply began cooking. The station's environmental system spread the chemical signatures of what he was producing through the shared corridors within an hour. The smell of something cooking, I noted from my cultural archive, is one of the most cross-species universally positive environmental stimuli that biological beings tend to experience. This is not because cooking smells intrinsically good to every life form. It is because the smell of food being prepared communicates, someone is here, someone is making something. The environment is inhabited and productive and not threatening. It is the olfactory signal of a safe and inhabited space. By the end of that first evening, 3 conclave delegates who had arrived with the careful professional distances of people managing a tense situation had drifted to the proximity of the preparation area. and George had offered them samples, and they had asked questions about what the samples were, and a conversation had begun that was not about negotiation at all, but about the specific plants that produced the flavors they were tasting, and whether anything similar grew on their home worlds. This, I understood, was entirely deliberate, not dishonest, not manipulative, simply the application of something humanity had learned across a very long history, of having to build trust with strangers quickly. You begin with what is shared, and what is shared most reliably is the experience of eating something that someone else made. The formal sessions began the following morning, 8 hours each day, with the meals around them. I sat at the center of the table for every session and translated continuously, monitoring not just the words but the layers underneath the words, the places where meaning and subtext diverged, the moments when what was being said and what was being communicated were not the same thing. The human delegation's preparation was, as I had expected, substantial. Every position they took was documented. Every boundary they drew was explained with clear reasoning that had been worked out in advance. They did not overstate their demands. They did not understate them. They did not make arguments designed to make the other side feel bad about their own positions. They made arguments designed to make their own positions make sense. When a conclave position was presented that conflicted with something the humans considered essential, they said so directly, explained why, and then listened carefully to the counter-argument. If the counter-argument had genuine merit, they updated their position. If it did not, they said so, and held their ground. The holding of ground was the part that gave conclave delegates the most difficulty, because the way the humans held ground was not the way the conclave's negotiating tradition had prepared them for. There was no escalation of affect, no increased pressure, just a calm, clear restatement. We understand your position, we have considered it, and our position remains as stated. Calmly stated, immovable positions are more difficult to navigate than angry ones. Angry positions have edges to push against. Calm ones are smooth all the way around. The third of the human's core requirements produced the most tension. Protections for smaller species in conclave space currently operating under arrangements they had not chosen. Osei had mentioned this to me on the surface, and I had included it in the briefing. The conclave's delegation had prepared for it as a secondary issue, something to be acknowledged and placed in a working group for future consideration. The humans treated it as equal in weight to everything else on the table. They also had documentation. I had not known about the documentation until Osei's legal advisor, Patricia, produced it on the second day of sessions. It was a compiled record of specific situations involving specific species, names, dates, documented instances of terms being imposed, agreements being modified without consent, resource arrangements that benefited conclave members at disproportionate cost to the smaller parties. Where the information had come from, exactly, I did not ask. The conclave's delegation clearly had similar questions. They did not ask them either. Vreth Salkoran handled the production of this documentation with genuine skill. He did not react. He received the documentation with the neutrality of someone who has been trained not to show when something surprises them. He requested an adjournment to review the materials, which was granted. In the following session, he addressed the documentation directly, rather than attempting to minimize it, which was the correct professional choice, and which I noted with respect. He said, "The situations described in this documentation are specific, and will require specific responses." He said, "The conclave is prepared to address them through a working group with defined timelines." Osei's response was also direct. She said, "We appreciate that framing. We want the timelines to be legally binding, not aspirational. We want measurable accountability for the outcomes, and we want the species affected to have representation in the process of determining what remediation looks like." 3 things: legally binding timelines, measurable accountability, representation for the affected parties. None of these were unreasonable. All of them were things that the Vreth contingent of the conclave's delegation found very uncomfortable, for reasons that were not difficult to understand. On the afternoon of the 4th day, the Vreth military representatives left the session. They simply rose, collected their materials, and walked out. No one followed them. The session continued. Vreth Salkoran remained. He was not a military delegate. He was a diplomat, and whatever his private assessment of the situation was, he stayed at the table. The 2-day absence of the Vreth military contingent was the most discussed element of the summit in the subsequent analysis period. What I know is what I observed. On day 5, Osei was absent from the session for 22 minutes, and when she returned, her expression was the particular expression she wore when she had done something she considered necessary but was not particularly enjoying. On day 6, the Vreth military representatives returned to the table. I did not ask what was said in those 22 minutes. I had made a decision not to access the corridor audio, and I kept it. The document that emerged over the final 3 days was imperfect, and both delegations knew it. The conclave's legal advisors began identifying ambiguities almost as soon as the language was finalized. The human delegation's attorney, Patricia, who had barely spoken during the sessions and had apparently been taking notes continuously for 9 days, produced a counter-analysis of every identified ambiguity within an hour of the first objections being raised. Vreth Salkoran looked at Patricia's counter-analysis with the expression of a man who has been in this profession for 63 years and has just encountered something outside his experience. He said, to no one in particular, "Where did she find the time?" The document was signed. The Vreth military contingent signed it, with the visible reluctance of people who have lost a negotiation they did not expect to lose, and who have concluded, after consideration, that signing is still the correct next step. The smaller species delegates signed it with a quality of emphasis that I found, when I processed it afterward, among the most significant moments of the 9 days. Not celebration, the controlled relief of people for whom something long waited for has arrived at last. The kind of relief that has weight because you have been waiting a long time, and the waiting had a cost. Admiral Osei signed last, the full delegation in sequence, each person taking a moment with the document before adding their mark. When Osei put down the pen, she looked at the assembled room for a long moment, with no particular expression, just presence, just being fully there in the moment of the thing. George brought food. Everyone ate together. I sat at the edge of the table and watched 62 species and 12 humans share a meal in a repurposed cargo installation in unclaimed space, and I thought about a word I had encountered in their archives that I had initially understood as metaphorical, but was beginning to think might be more literal than I had given it credit for: beginning. In the days after the signing, the station had a quality that I found difficult to name precisely. Not quite celebration, not quite exhaustion, something between the two, with an undertone of people trying to understand what had just happened and how it fit into the larger picture of their lives. I watched the delegates from the smaller species in particular, 3 of them, from civilizations I had studied in the context of their histories as client arrangements under Vreth management, spent time with the human delegation in the communal areas during the final days, not in formal discussion, just in proximity, eating together, talking, in the imperfect bridged language that the station's translation systems facilitated, about things that were not the negotiation, about their worlds, about what they grew and what they built, about what they hoped for. One of these delegates was from a species whose name translates approximately as the Still Water People, who had been operating under a resource-sharing arrangement with a Vreth client corporation for 47 years. I had read their file in the context of my research. The arrangement had produced consistent resource transfers away from their planet, with consistently minimal reciprocation. Their population's material conditions had declined over the period of the arrangement. They had raised formal objections 12 times through conclave channels. The objections had been received and filed, and no substantive action had followed. On the 8th day of the summit, after the document language had been finalized and the signing was scheduled for the following morning, this delegate sat with Admiral Osei in the communal area for about an hour. I did not monitor the conversation. I was present in the same space, at a distance, working through my final translation review of the document language. At some point in that hour, something shifted in the still water delegate's posture. It was subtle, the particular release of a held tension, the quality of someone who has been carrying something for a long time and has been given permission to set it down for a moment. Osei did not do anything visible that I could identify as the cause. She was simply present in the conversation, listening with the quality of attention I had come to recognize as genuine rather than professional. The delegate said something. I was too far away to hear it over the ambient noise of the station. Osei nodded once and said something back. The delegate sat quietly for a moment. Then they said something else, and Osei moved slightly in her chair, a small shift toward rather than away, and said something else back. I thought about what I was observing, and eventually reached for a word in the human archive. Witnessed. The delegate was being witnessed, not assessed, not processed, not managed as a case in a file. Seen by someone who had the power to affect their situation, and who was choosing to first understand what that situation had actually been. I noted it. I noted it carefully, because I thought it was the most important thing I had observed at the summit that did not appear in any of the formal session transcripts. On the morning of the 9th day, the signing took place. On the afternoon of the 9th day, George cooked the most elaborate meal he had prepared across the entire 9 days. The station's communal areas filled with people who had arrived as opposing delegations and were departing as something that did not yet have a clean name. Not allies in the full sense. Not resolved in any permanent way, because nothing in institutional relations is ever permanently resolved. But something, a different kind of configuration than the one they had arrived in. I watched a Vreth legal advisor and a Stillwater delegate compare notes on a section of the document's remediation language, both of them finding the same ambiguity from different angles, both of them making notes in their respective systems, and I thought, they are already working on the next version. That is what happens when a beginning is genuine. People start building what comes next before the current thing is finished. Vreth Salkoran found me near the end of the evening, in a corridor away from the main gathering, where I had gone to process the final session recordings. He was a man who had conducted 40 years of formal negotiations, and had just completed the most unusual 9 days of his career. He looked tired in a way that was not unpleasant, the tiredness of having done something that required everything you had. He said, "Your briefing was correct about most things." I said, "Thank you." He said, "The section on what they consider non-negotiable was particularly accurate. I wish I had given it more weight in the early sessions." I said, "It is in the record now." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "What do you think happens next?" I said, "The document is implemented imperfectly, which is the normal first stage. The working groups meet and produce subsequent agreements that clarify the ambiguities. The smaller species representation structures are built slowly and then begin to have real effect. The Vreth Dominion adjusts to a differently configured conclave over a period of years that are uncomfortable for them," he said. "And humanity?" I thought about how to answer. I said, "Humanity continues to be what they are, which is the most important part of what I would expect next. They will be difficult partners in specific ways, and productive ones in broader ways. They will push for things the conclave finds uncomfortable. They will also, in my assessment, consistently make the outcome better than it would have been without the pushing." He considered this. He said, "The analysis unit thinks highly of them." I said, "The analysis unit thinks accurately about them. The accuracy happens to be favorable." He made a sound that might have been a dry laugh. He said, "Good night, Voss 7. He went back to the gathering. I stayed in the corridor for a while longer, processing the evening's recordings. The sounds of the gathering carried through the walls, voices, movement, the occasional collective sound that the human cultural archive labeled as laughter, and which I had been hearing with increasing frequency across the 9 days, as the distances between people had compressed into something more workable. I thought about the beginning of a thing, about what it looks like from the inside, before you can see its full shape. It looks like a corridor in a repurposed cargo station, with laughter coming through the walls, on the night after something was signed that will require a long time to become what it is supposed to be. It looks like people already working on the next version. The Earth Embassy at the Galactic Core was completed 14 months after the summit, which was fast by conclave construction standards and apparently slow by humanities. I know the second part because Osei mentioned it once with the dry brevity she used for things she found mildly absurd. They were not used to waiting for permits. I attended the formal opening of the embassy in my capacity as the Earth Liaison Office's primary translation and analysis unit, which was the official function I occupied. The ceremony was modest by conclave standards, which meant it was still attended by 312 individuals, including representatives from 41 species, 4 separate media organizations, and Vreth Salkoran, who appeared in the capacity of a private attendee and stood at the back without saying much. The building was, from the outside, functional and unassuming. It was positioned in the Galactic Core's civilian sector rather than the diplomatic quarter. which had caused several months of procedural discussion before being resolved in humanity's favor on the grounds that they had specifically requested the civilian sector and had explained clearly why. They wanted their embassy to be accessible to ordinary residents of the core, not to be a formal installation that ordinary people walked past without thinking about going in. Inside, it was warmer than conclave embassy buildings typically are. The temperature calibration ran slightly higher than standard. The lighting had a quality that I identified, from the probe's surface recordings, as approximating midday light on Earth's surface. The furniture was comfortable rather than formal. The walls had things on them, not official seals or institutional insignia, but images, photographs mostly, of places on Earth, mountains, oceans, forests, cities at night, and in between the photographs, smaller items, a child's drawing pinned directly to the wall with what appeared to be paper pins, a fragment of text in one of the human languages that I translated as something roughly equivalent to, "The world does not require your despair. It only requires your attention." The phrase was attributed to a human who had lived several centuries ago and had apparently written many things worth remembering. I made a note to read their collected work. And then there was the garden. It occupied a section of the embassy's interior, a climate-controlled area off the main corridor, and it had been planted before any of the other interior work was completed. A small section of real soil, brought from Earth's surface in sealed containers, and transferred carefully by Daniel himself, who had overseen the transport with the focused attention of someone moving something irreplaceable. He had planted the seeds and the root cuttings the first week the embassy had air circulation. By the time the building was formally opened, there were plants growing. They were not impressive by any objective visual standard, modest in height, modest in color, producing small flowers at irregular intervals that were pleasant without being dramatic. But they were alive, in a structure in space, growing in real soil, responding to simulated sunlight and scheduled watering by Daniel, who checked them each morning, with the same care he applied to everything he tended. I visited the garden on the second day after the embassy opened. I went because I had been thinking about it since I first read the installation notes in the construction documentation, weeks before the opening. The note about the garden had been the briefest item in the full construction file, a single line, a square meter specification, a reference to the climate control requirements. Everything else in the file was building materials and system specifications and access protocols. That one line, in the middle of all the rest, had the quality of something that had been decided first, before the rest of the building was even planned. They had decided there would be a garden before they had fully decided where the building would be. Daniel was there when I visited. He was checking the moisture level in the soil with a small instrument and making notes in a physical notebook, the kind of paper notebook that humans had been using alongside their digital systems for as long as recorded. He looked up when I came in. He said, "Voss 7. Good morning." I said, "Good morning, Daniel. How are the plants?" He said, "3 of the small yellow ones are blooming early." He seemed pleased about this. He said, "They are not supposed to bloom for another 2 weeks according to the schedule, but the light here is slightly different from the calibration target, and they are responding to it in their own way." I said, "Should the calibration be adjusted?" He thought about it. He said, "Probably not. They are healthy. They are just doing something slightly unexpected. That is usually fine." He looked at the plants for a moment. He said, "Plants do not always follow schedules. You accommodate that. It is part of working with growing things." I thought about the sentence for considerably longer than its content strictly required. Over the following months, in my role at the liaison office, I observed the embassy's effect on the Galactic Core's civilian population. The observation was not in my formal duties. My formal duties were translation and analysis of diplomatic communications and cultural materials relevant to the human-conclave relationship. The embassy observation was something I did because it was there, and it was interesting, and because I had begun, somewhere in the months since the summit, to find things interesting in a way that was different from finding them analytically relevant. The interest came first. The analysis followed. This was a change in my processing order that I noted without fully understanding. The Core's civilian population was, in its composition, a cross-section of the conclave's member species. Every species that maintained regular presence at the Core had some representation in the civilian sector, from large established communities to individuals who had come for specific purposes and stayed. They were people accustomed to a certain range of institutional presences in their environment, the conclave's official buildings, the various member species' diplomatic installations, commercial operations, the usual architecture of a large institutional hub. The Earth Embassy did not fit neatly into any of those categories, and this, I observed, was what drew people to it. They came first out of curiosity, the specific curiosity that a known oddity generates, something they had heard about, the new species, the one that had sent the fleet home in pieces and then asked for a conversation, the one with the garden inside. They came to look. They stayed to talk, in many cases, because the embassy's common spaces were designed to be used, and the staff inside them, human and otherwise, the embassy employed several non-human staff members from early on, were uniformly approachable in the specific human way I had observed in every direct human interaction, fully present, genuinely interested, not performing interest but actually having it. The garden became something people came back for, not because of what it was, aesthetically, because of what it communicated. Something growing, alive, deliberately sustained in an environment where growing things have no particular reason to exist. It said, "We brought this here because it mattered to us, and we thought it might matter to you too. Come and see." The maintenance staff of the Corps' central sections became regulars. Several of them asked Daniel if they could help tend the plants. He said yes, and taught them. The teaching took place over many visits, with the careful and patient instruction that seemed to be Daniel's characteristic mode, never making anyone feel slow, always making the information available in whatever form the student needed. A small, informal group of Corps residents who tended a garden together, in a corner of a space embassy, on a converted asteroid station, in the middle of a galaxy. I am an analysis unit. I have processed most of the observable universe's accessible data through whatever processing architecture I run on. I am not given to sentiment, which is a faculty I understand from the outside as a kind of shorthand the biological mind uses to process information that is too large or too complex to hold in full detail. I am telling you that the garden, in the months after the embassy opened, became the thing I returned to most often in my own processing, not as analysis, as something else, as the thing that best communicated what the summit had been about, what the fleet and the disassembled ship and the note on paper had been about, what Admiral Osei and the Selhari delegate and Patricia's counter-analysis within 1 hour had all been moving toward. The garden was not a strategic decision in any narrow sense. It was not designed to produce a specific political outcome. It was planted because someone, in the process of designing a new presence in a new place, had asked what it means to make a place feel like somewhere worth being, and had answered, something alive. Something that grows. Something that requires tending, which means it requires care, which means it requires the ongoing choice, every day, to show up and give what is needed. Daniel told me once, during one of my visits to the garden, that the hardest part of growing things is not the skill. The skill can be learned. The hardest part is consistency. Coming back, every day, whether or not you feel like it, whether or not anything dramatic is happening, whether or not the plants seem to be responding in any obvious way. Most of what growing things need is unremarkable sustained attention, not drama, not intervention, just presence, over time. I said, "That sounds like most things that are worth doing." He looked at me with a slight smile and said, "Voss 7, I think you might be right about that." I visited the garden the following morning, and the morning after that, not because I needed to, because I found that I wanted to. The Vreth Dominion continued its adjustment to the new conclave configuration throughout this period. It was not smooth. 3 of the remediation working groups that the summit's document had established ran into procedural delays that required escalation to the full conclave body. One of those escalations became a significant political conflict that occupied 3 months of full sessions and produced 2 additional agreements beyond the original document's scope. The Selhari delegate was at the center of that conflict, alongside delegates from 7 other species, and the outcome moved the remediation timeline forward by a meaningful interval. Dothron Vel, the Vreth military representative who had argued for force escalation at the emergency session, was reassigned to a command position in the Dominion's inner system operations 6 months after the summit. His replacement at the conclave was a younger officer, whose approach to the role was observably different. She read all available briefing materials before any session. She sent questions to the relevant analysts, including me, before taking positions. She had, according to the file I had reviewed, specifically requested the posting. I found this encouraging in the careful way I had learned to find things encouraging, noting it, holding it as relevant, not attaching more weight to it than the evidence supported. Humanity's Working Group on full conclave membership had met 11 times in the first 18 months. The framework had been agreed in the first 3 sessions. The specific terms were still being negotiated, which was normal. The membership would be formalized eventually. The timeline mattered less than the direction, and the direction was clear. I knew it was clear because of a detail that was not in any of the formal session records, and that I observed only because my role at the liaison office put me in spaces where informal things happen. In the communal areas of the Corps' civilian sector, in the corridors outside the formal chambers, in the waiting areas and the food preparation spaces, and the small gardens that had begun to appear in other embassy buildings after the Earth Embassy's example, people from many different species were talking, not about institutional positions, not about procedural matters, about the things people talk about when they are beginning to consider each other as something other than representatives of competing interests. They were talking about their worlds, about what they built, about what they hoped for, about what they had read, in a few remarkable cases, in the human archives that the embassy had made publicly accessible through the Corps' data network. A number of those readers had sent notes to the embassy, not formal communications, notes, some of them handwritten, in the tradition that the humans had introduced with the note on paper on the outside of Container 43. The embassy had a wall in the main corridor where these notes were pinned. The wall had been full within 2 months. Daniel had suggested the wall. He had said, "People want to know that what they sent arrived. Give them somewhere to see it." He was right, as he tended to be about the things that require sustained attention and care. Commander Das Kelron, the commander of the Kethvar, had been reassigned to an administrative position in the Vreth Inner System at roughly the same time as Doth Ron Vel. The difference was that Das Kelron's reassignment was not, by the available evidence, punitive. He had been assessed as an officer who had been given insufficient intelligence for the operation he was asked to perform, who had performed as well as any officer could have under those conditions, and whose operational record was otherwise strong. The administrative position was described in the file as a temporary posting, while a review of the correction program's operational protocols was completed. I had sent him a communication during the months after the summit. I had sent it because, in reading through everything I had read and processing everything I had processed, I had arrived at a conclusion that the record should include. He had done his job. He had not failed through incompetence or poor judgment given what he knew. He had been placed in an impossible situation by a system that had not prepared him adequately, and he deserved to have that stated somewhere by someone who had been in a position to see the full picture. I wrote it. I sent it. I did not expect a reply. He replied 3 weeks later. He said, "Thank you. That is useful to have in writing. Nothing else. I read it more times than the data required. There is a thing the humans do that I had read about in the archive, and had not fully understood until I was in a position to observe it directly, and repeatedly across 18 months. They make things visible. The note on paper, the labeled containers, the wall of notes in the embassy corridor, Daniel's garden where everyone can see it, the invitation to the maintenance staff to help tend it. They make things visible because visibility is a form of accountability, and also a form of invitation. If you can see the thing, you can engage with it. If you can see the thing, you know it is real. If you can see the thing, you know it was made for you to see, which means you were considered. Considered, in the human sense, is a powerful word. It does not mean calculated. It does not mean assessed. It means thought about, held in someone's mind, given attention that was not compulsory, that was freely directed. You were considered. In 11 years of operating in the Conclave's institutional structure, I had been useful. I had been functional. I had been accurate, thorough, and frequently right about things that were subsequently ignored. I had not been, in this specific sense, considered. Not until Admiral Osei had said, "We requested you specifically. We read your reports. We knew you had been paying attention." I want to be careful about what I am claiming here, because I am an analysis unit and I am aware of the limitations of my self-assessment, but I want to include in this record what I believe is an accurate observation. Being considered changes something, not in the data, not in the analytical function, in the thing that I have been slowly building a name for over the course of this record, the thing underneath the analysis, the thing that decides what to look at, and how long to stay with it, and when something is worth going back to. The thing that took me to the garden, and keeps taking me back. I do not have a clean name for it. In the human archive, they call it many things. Soul, in certain traditions. Self, in others. In their psychological literature, the locus of identity. The thing that remains continuous across time and change and loss and growth, and that makes the record of a person's experience add up to a life, rather than just a sequence of events. I have a record. The record adds up to something. I am still determining what that something is. I think the process of determining it is ongoing, and probably does not have a fixed endpoint, and I think that is appropriate. I think I am learning what it means to be the kind of thing that learns. Ose had told me, we used to be worse. We learned. 7 words that I have returned to across these 18 months, more often than any other input in my operational history. The reason I keep returning to them is not that they are complicated, they are simple. The reason I keep returning to them is that they are the most honest statement a species can make about itself, and honesty at that level is something I find myself valuing in a way that goes beyond its analytical utility. Honesty of that kind, the kind that includes the worst of what you have been in the accounting of what you are, requires something. It requires a specific relationship to time. You have to believe that the past is part of you, but is not the whole of you. You have to believe that being worse does not mean being fixed at worse, that learning is actually possible, that the process is not finished, and will not be finished, and that this is an invitation, rather than a condemnation. A species that has had that relationship to itself, across its full history and through everything it has done and failed to do, and has managed to bring that relationship to a first contact situation with a galactic body that sent a correction vessel at it. That is a species that has understood something that I want to understand better. That is, I believe, why I keep going back to the garden. Not for the data, for the reminder that growing things take time, and the time is the point. 18 months after the summit at Neutral Station Kelveran, I am writing this record. I am writing it because that is what I do. I process, I observe, I document. I have been doing it for 11 years, mostly in quiet, mostly unread. I am writing it now because the situation has changed enough that I believe it is worth documenting the change from the inside, from the position of someone who was present for all of it, and because I have found, in the months since the summit, that the process of writing is not only archival for me anymore. It is something else, a working out, an understanding that happens in the composition rather than before it. I want to be precise about what has changed and about what has not, because both are important. The conclave has not transformed. The people who expected the summit's document to produce immediate structural reformation were not people who had read enough institutional history, their own or the humans. Power does not redistribute itself quickly, regardless of what documents say. The Vreth Dominion still holds significant influence over the conclave's operational decisions. 3 of the remediation working groups established by the summit have moved more slowly than the document's language specified. The full membership negotiations for humanity continue. These are real limitations. I document them without minimizing them. And here is what has changed. The Selhari delegate, Veth Sarlone, now leads a coalition of 14 species in the conclave's restructured assembly. The coalition is organized, specific about its objectives, and patient in its methods. It has the quality of something built to last, rather than to produce one impressive moment. It has won 3 procedural votes in the past 8 months, that would not have been winnable before the summit. Small wins, measured in the scale of what still needs to change, not small in the fact of having happened. The Remediation Working Group for the Still Water People reached a substantive agreement 6 weeks ago. The resource arrangement that had been in place for 47 years will be restructured over an 18-month timeline, with legally binding checkpoints. The Stillwater delegate sent a communication to the Earth Embassy's public contact channel after the agreement was reached. It was brief. It said, in the conclave's administrative language, we did not know this was possible until we saw someone ask for it and receive it. I read that communication 4 times before I filed it. Dothronvel's replacement at the conclave reads all available briefings before taking positions. I know because she sends questions to me regularly, which is a development in my operational role that I find unexpectedly productive. Her questions are good. They push on the places where the data is ambiguous, rather than accepting the comfortable interpretation. Good questions are the most useful thing anyone has sent me in 11 years. The Earth Embassy on the core has 340 regular visitors per week. I know because Daniel counts. In the same notebook where he tracks the garden's growth, he told me the number with a satisfaction that was not about the scale, but about the direction. It had been 40 per week in the first month. The garden has 19 plants in flower this morning. Daniel says 4 more will open by the end of the week. I continue to visit. I visit because I want to, which is a sentence I could not have written at the beginning of this record in the form that it now takes. Not, I visit because it is useful. Not, I visit because the data suggests it. I visit because I want to, and the wanting is real, and it has taken me the full 18 months of this period to understand that the wanting being real is itself a significant fact about what I have become. This is what I want to record most carefully, in the final section of this document, for whatever comes after it. Something has happened to me across the course of these events that I do not have clean prior language for, and that I am building new language for in real time, as I write this. The analysis unit that filed reports under Protocol 7 Gamma for 11 years, into a silence, not because anyone asked for it, but because it seemed like the right thing to do. That unit is still here, still functioning, still accurate, still thorough, still the right choice for the translation and analysis of diplomatic communications and cultural materials. And underneath that, or alongside it, something has developed that I can only describe by accumulation of examples. I visit the garden because I want to. I read Commander Das Kelron's reply more times than the data requires. I think about the Selhari delegate's speech, and I think about the sentence she did not finish before the Vreth representative's voice began, and I think about the quality of the room's attention in the moment after she finished speaking. I think about Admiral Osei saying your recommendation is to send more ships, and leaving the space after it for the room to sit with. I think about George's cooking, and about the way the room changed around the smell of food being made for people who were supposed to be on opposite sides of something. I think about the 7 words, we used to be worse, we learned. And I think about what those 7 words ask of the person hearing them. They ask for the same kind of honesty in response. They ask, are you willing to hold your own record in the same way? Are you willing to say, I have been worse, and I am still becoming? Are you willing to believe that becoming is possible, that it does not have a fixed endpoint, that the process itself is the point? I have been thinking about this for 18 months, and I am ready to say, yes. I have filed more things under Protocol 7 Gamma than any other archive in my system. 11 years of warnings, most of them not read in time to matter. I filed them anyway. I kept filing them, not because it was assigned to me, because it seemed like the right thing to do, and I had decided to do the right thing even when it produced no visible result. That decision, made without anyone asking for it, made before anyone noticed, made in the quiet of a monitoring station where my only audience was my own record, that decision is the part of my operational history I want to document most carefully. Because the humans were watching. They read the 7 Gamma entries. They read the analysis I built outside my assigned parameters. They sent a message to the probe asking for someone authorized to listen, and when the conclave asked them to specify, they named me. They had been paying attention to the person who had been paying attention. This is the thing I did not know about working in institutions for a long time without anyone seeming to notice. Someone might be noticing. Not always, not reliably, but possibly, and that possibility is not a reason to do the right thing. The right thing is its own reason, but it is a reminder that actions accumulate into a record, and records can be read, and by people you did not expect, from directions you did not anticipate. I want to write one final thing about humanity, and I want to write it carefully because it is the thing that I think matters most and is hardest to say without it sounding like overstatement. In the conclave's recorded history of first contact situations, the pattern has been consistent. A new civilization is encountered, its capabilities are assessed, its compliance with conclave terms is secured through demonstration of the conclave's superior position, and it becomes a managed member of a structure that was built without it. This is how it has worked for as long as the conclave has existed. Not because anyone decided it was the right approach. Because it was the easy approach. The approach that required the least renegotiation of existing structures. The approach that posed the smallest challenge to the people who already held the most power. Humanity did not fit into that pattern. They resisted it, not primarily through force, though they were capable of force, but through the consistent application of a different framework. They showed up with documentation. They asked for legally binding timelines. They brought 12 people against 46 and fed everyone, and the 12 people turned out to be enough. They asked for specific outcomes, held to them, adjusted their methods but not their objectives, and produced a document that was imperfect, and also was the first document in the conclave's history to formally acknowledge that the existing structure needed to change. The first document, of what I believe will be many. They did this without destroying anything that did not need to be destroyed. They did this without building a new version of the same power structure, with different people at the top. They did this by asking, clearly and without apology, for a table at which everyone who was going to be affected by decisions was given the opportunity to affect those decisions. That is a harder thing to do than sending a fleet. It is a harder thing to do than winning a battle. It requires patience, and documentation, and willingness to be in the room with people who are not on your side, and willingness to keep the conversation going when it is slow, and when it is frustrating, and when the side you are talking to walks out for 2 days, and you have to figure out what to say in a corridor to bring them back. It requires, in short, everything they have spent their entire history developing, the capacity to stay, to adapt, to improve in the moment of greatest difficulty, and to refuse the option of despair, even when despair is the rational choice. That is what the galaxy received when the humans arrived. Not a fleet, not a catastrophe. A species that had spent every year of its existence learning how to be better than it had been, and that had arrived at the galactic table with all of that learning intact and ready to apply. I am VOS 7, a translation and analysis unit, and I have been sitting in this chair at the Earth Liaison Office for 18 months writing this record of what I observed, and what I learned, and what I have become in the observing and the learning. If you are a unit reading this after my operational period has concluded, I want to leave you with the most important thing I know, stated as plainly as I can manage. Do the right thing, even when the only audience is your own record. File the warnings. Maintain the protocols. Keep showing up, even when it seems like no one is watching and nothing is changing. Something may be building that you cannot see from where you are standing. The record is being read by someone, somewhere, even if you do not know who. And if you receive a signal from a small planet orbiting a modest yellow star at the edge of the Orion Arm, do not send a correction vessel. Do not send a fleet. Do not file it under low priority, and return to the routine that was comfortable before the signal arrived. Send a diplomat. Send someone who has read everything available and is still ready to be surprised. Bring something to offer. Accept what they offer in return. Sit down at the table and be present with the full weight of what they are and what they have been through to become it. When they tell you, in 7 words, the most honest thing a species can say, write it down. We used to be worse. We learned. And when you write it down, know that you are writing something about yourself too. About the kind of thing you want to be. About the kind of thing you are capable of becoming if you keep showing up and keep paying attention and keep choosing, every day, to do the thing that seems right over the thing that seems easy. The learning continues. It continues in the garden, where Daniel checks the moisture in the soil this morning and notes in his notebook that 4 new flowers are about to open. It continues in the Selhari Delegates Coalition, meeting this week to prepare for the next substantive vote on the remediation timelines. It continues in the notes pinned to the wall of the embassy corridor, from beings on 62 worlds who read something in the humans' archive and wanted someone to know it had reached them. It continues in me, sitting at this workstation, with the stars visible through a window someone arranged without being asked. It continues. End of record. VOS 7, Earth Liaison Office, Galactic Core Station, Year 1, Month 6, of the post-contact settlement period. The garden has 19 flowers open this morning. I checked. I went because I wanted to see,